It's the question that's tripped up Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, Angela Rayner and many more. And now scheming Sturgeon has refused to define what a woman is. Following the disturbing trajectory of spineless politicians who've shirked the topic, the Scottish First Minister shut down a reporter from The Times who broached the issue earlier in this week, lashing out by saying, I'm just not going to get into this debate at a level that's about simplified and lurid headlines. Trans people are amongst possibly the most stigmatised and discriminated against minorities in our society. And every time we oversimplify this debate, trans people actually suffer. And I think it's important that's such a tiny minority that we actually take the issues around protecting and enhancing the rights of trans people seriously. I do not believe that trans rights and women's rights are or should in any way be in conflict, and I will argue that case until my dying breath. And that, I think, is the basis on which we should try to progress this debate. Now, it comes amid controversial reforms planned by the SNP that would allow people in Scotland to change their legal sex just by signing a declaration, no longer needing a medical diagnosis or the approval of a doctor. So, as she becomes the latest politician to swerve the question, should Nicola Sturgeon have committed to defining a woman? I want to hear your views on this down at gbnews.uk, at GBNews, and we've got our Twitter poll running there too. But weighing in on this hot-button issue, former Team G Olympic swimmer Sharon Davies, human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell, and Executive Director of Sex Matters, Maya Forstater. Maya, honestly, could you believe it when you read this response from Sturgeon? Because she was simply asked to define what a woman was. No one was asking her about trans rights, which I'm sure we all agree are important.
I wasn't surprised. She's been shutting down this debate for years and years and refusing to listen to women's rights campaigners who say that there's a conflict of rights. So, honestly, I wasn't surprised, but I'm still disappointed. Politicians should be able to say what a woman is.
Indeed. Sharon Davies, I presume you agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, my area of expertise is sport, and I can tell you categorically that it really matters in sport. And to say that there's no conflict of interest is absolutely not true. If we can't explain, what a biological female is, then how on earth do we protect their right to have fair sport? So, I just think it doesn't help the trans issue. I think it actually makes the trans issue more difficult. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being a transgender woman or a transgender man and being explained as a transgender man or a transgender woman. I think clear language enables all of us to protect our beliefs and be able to talk to each other and understand each other better.
But Peter Tatchell, you thought Sturgeon's answer was the right one. Why?
Not quite. I mean, what I do say is that I think that the fuss about the definition diverts us from the really pressing issue about protecting the dignity, rights, welfare and safeguarding of all women, including trans women. So if I was asked that question, I'd say it's very simple. There are two different kinds of women. There is a woman defined by her biological sex, and there is another different form of woman defined by her gender identity. They are different, they're not the same, but both are equally valid. And I think we need to try and find the common ground instead of what divides us, because all women, including trans women, do suffer from misogyny, hate crime, domestic violence, rape, and so on. And let's all work together, for heaven's sake, to protect all women.
Mike, can you just respond to Peter as to why the definition does matter?
The definition matters because, as Peter said, women and trans women are not the same. When it comes to sports, when it comes to safeguarding, when it comes to getting pregnant, when it comes to anything, there is nothing that I know about being a trans woman because it's impossible for me to be a trans woman. Peter could become a trans woman, but I couldn't. If somebody wants to call themselves a woman in their private life, they should be able to. But when it comes to places where sex matters, whether that's prisons, women's refuges, women's toilets, changing rooms, girls' schools, boys' schools, the definition matters. And the definition is about being male or female, not about gender identity.
And Maya, you have concerns, don't you, about these new Scottish policies which are going to essentially allow for self-ID?
Yes, so the Westminster government has decided not to go ahead with reforming the Gender Recognition Act to allow anyone to change their sex just by making a declaration. But the government in Edinburgh wants to go ahead with this year, and their proposal is to allow a child as young as 16 to change their legal sex. After having thought about it for just 3 months, they will be able to apply, and 3 months later they would be able to have their legal sex changed without ever seeing a doctor, without ever having their mental health assessed, without ever having anyone go through with them why they're feeling this way and whether it really is a long-term decision that they want to make at the age of 16.
Is that right? That Sturgeon policy?
That's what the Scottish Parliament.
No. I completely understand. But I'm just checking if Peter, that you think that policy is the right one.
Well, the proposal for self-ID is not simply signing a declaration. It is signing a statutory declaration in front of a justice of the peace or a solicitor or some other qualified professional, which has the legal force of law. And if someone violates what they have declared, in theory at least, they could be prosecuted for fraud. So it's not simply a case you can just walk in and sign a declaration and get away with things scot-free. Moreover, obviously, I understand the concerns that some women have, and I sympathise, but I think that you will find that the vast majority of women who want to go through this process are already living commendable, laudable lives as trans women. They haven't harmed anyone. They're not a threat to anyone. And what this whole argument is underlying is the idea that trans women are somehow a threat, potential predators to other women. Now, it is true that there may be a small number who are a threat, but they are tiny and unrepresentative. And when we make law in this country, we do not base it on what a minority of bad apples may do. We base it on the majority. So, for example, no one in their right mind with any decency would dare suggest that we restrict Muslims because a handful happen to be terrorists. Most Muslims are not terrorists and do not support terrorism.
But Sharon, I've spoken to you.
By the same token, we should not demonise the whole trans community.
No, but Sharon, I've spoken to you.
Anybody.
No, and I was going to say, Sharon, I've spoken to you about this topic a lot over the years, and I have never heard you demonise anyone trans. Actually, quite the opposite. But what you're trying to do is protect women.
Yeah, absolutely. And protect trans women as well, and trans men. The policies that we have in place at the moment for sport totally and utterly ignore trans men who are biological females who just don't seem to matter because they're no threat to men's sports. And no one is taking any consideration for them whatsoever, the same way they're not really taking any consideration for biological female athletes who, train just as hard as men and are losing their opportunities in sport, as we've been seeing over the last few years, quite considerably. And if it carries on, we will not have any female successes. We will only have men winning the men's races and males winning the female races. So there's got to be a way for us to understand our language so that we can put protections in place. And, whether that means that we set up, crisis centres for women and crisis centres for trans women, I don't understand why that would be such an issue. I would imagine that the attention that you would need as a trans woman may be slightly different than the attention that you would need as a woman, because biologically you are different. So I don't know that there would be any demonising. I just think it enables us to talk honestly and fairly and protect everybody, because personally, from my point of view, I love sport and I want everyone to be involved in sport, but I do want it to be fair.
Yeah, but we don't want to oversee the destruction of female sport. Of course we don't. I just want to come back to Sturgeon. Of course, she's made this comment in the run-up to the local elections, which are on Thursday, and you are the co-founder of this brilliant campaign that I completely support, Respect My Sex If You Want My Ex, where you are saying that you believe voters should simply ask the people running for office, what is a woman? Now, Sturgeon has failed your test.
Absolutely. And she's trying to push through self-ID in Scotland. I mean, it's one thing to ask politicians in England to define sex, but it's a much more urgent question in Scotland. And we need to be asking MSPs and MPs to really think through what the impacts of this proposal will be on women, on girls, on sport, and on single-sex services, and they haven't done that. And she's saying, oh, we shouldn't talk about this in lurid sound bites. No, we shouldn't talk about it in lurid sound bites. We should talk about it seriously. And there are women in Scotland who are crying out for this, and Nicola Sturgeon is ignoring them.
Yeah, and
it does seem very degrading.
Peter, you come in first, Peter, and then I'll come to you, Sharon. Peter, come in.
I understand the concerns, but trans women have been using women's toilets for decades with virtually no problems ever. No complaints by other women, no incidents. The idea that a man would dress up as a woman and use self-ID as a way of getting into a woman's toilet, I think is a bit fanciful.
Okay, Maya, your response to that?
Bad things to women will just go ahead and do them. And I think I've got a friend of mine.
Peter, just let Maya respond to that. Peter, just let Maya respond to that specific point.
And she has had trans women in that women's centre with the agreement of both the staff and the clients for 5 or 6 years.
Peter, just hold up 1 second. Just let Maya respond to that specific point.
I think your opinion about who goes into women's toilets is neither here nor there. It's about women. Many women do not want to undress with male people, whatever their gender identity. That's the honest truth. And
okay,
while you
understand
might
that,
think it's fine,
Sharon, I want to give you the final word.
I just find it, really frustrating that people don't ask women, that men seem to be making decisions, as they are in America at the moment, about women's bodies and women's rights. And the fact that we get called, I think, bodies rather than women is just so degrading. And it's not right that we're losing our language. It's just not right.
Fascinating debate.
But Sharon, the majority of women in Scotland who've been polled support trans rights. Yes, the majority of women
the majority of people that have polled about sport do not support trans women in sport. So we can argue those points, but, I'm going to disagree.
Fascinating debate. Certainly not one of lurid sound bites. I'm sure you'll all agree. Thank you so much. That was the former Team GB Olympic swimmer, Sharon Davies, the human rights campaigner, Peter Tatchell, and the executive director of Sex Matters, Maya Forstater.